sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. Let's get right into it. On this episode, we are going to examine the impact addiction can have on communities and neighborhoods, both large and small. We will also be examining the community response to addiction and drug abuse. I feel like this is an important subject that is often overlooked when we are talking about and dealing with addiction on such a huge scale, especially amidst the current addiction epidemic, and I would say opioid epidemic. But the simple fact is that this is really an addiction epidemic. If opioids did not exist, I truly believe that other substances would simply take the place of opioids. We are going to focus on many substance abuse addictions in this episode, and we will be looking at the connections between addiction, poverty, crime, and homelessness. But before we get to that, I wanted to remind everyone that you can listen to every episode of the show on our website at www.addictionspodcast.wordpress.com. One more time, that's addictionspodcast.wordpress.com. Just click the episodes link at the top of the page. You can also stay up to date with the show by liking our Facebook page at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. You can also follow us on Twitter. We are at addictionscast, or just visit twitter.com/addictionscast. And as always, thank you all for listening. Now on with the show. As we all know, addiction does not discriminate based on race or financial status. It can affect basically anyone under the right circumstances. From the depths of the largest cities to the rural neighborhoods and countryside to wealthy suburbs, addiction can be found anywhere. Something we seldom talk about or address when we discuss addiction is the impact that it has on communities and neighborhoods and society in general. Again, this is a very real issue that I feel is worth taking a look at. First off, let's talk a little about what I have seen in my local community. The city of Greenville is basically what I would call my community. I mean, I live outside of the city of Greenville, but that is where most of the people that I know live, and it's also the area where pretty much all community events happen. As of 2016, the city had a population of a little over 8,000 people. And the city actually took a very large hit economically about a decade ago when several manufacturing factories outsourced production to other countries. One of the companies that moved production out of Greenville was called Electrolux. Electrolux employed somewhere around 2,000 people, many of which lived in the city of Greenville, and as you can imagine, this was a major hit to the small city's already struggling economy. Many of those former employees had to turn their lives upside down and move to other cities as there were just no jobs in Greenville that paid the kind of wages that Electrolux paid. Of those who stayed, many took jobs at wages sometimes less than half of what they were making. As you might imagine, this was a very stressful situation for many people and their families. And we all know that stress over financial worries can take its toll on anyone. And for some, it can reach a breaking point, and a person may find themselves coping with stress in unhealthy ways. I have been attempting to obtain records that would help me determine if there were any spikes in drug overdose, reported drug and alcohol use, or drug-related crimes in Greenville in the first couple years after all of those jobs left the city. As of the recording of this episode, I have yet to get my hands on those records. But to be perfectly honest with you, I would not doubt it one bit if Greenville did indeed see a large bump in the number of people abusing drugs and alcohol within the city limits. At the time that those factories left the city of Greenville, I had been experimenting with various drugs myself for a couple of years. Nothing major. Some weed here and there, drinking some alcohol once in a while. I was like 19 or 20 years old around then. So what I'm saying is that I could recognize the drug scene, And to be honest, it really seemed like more and more people I knew were starting to use drugs or drinking more and more regularly. One thing that really struck me about Greenville was that about a decade ago, I never saw homeless people in the city of Greenville. However, with the major economic blows that Greenville has recently been dealt, I now see homeless people on a regular basis within the city limits. So anyways, getting back to what I was talking about, we don't have the numbers for my local area, but we do have the numbers for other cities and rural areas around the country, and these numbers tell a story. But we must not forget that we really do have a chance to give this story a happy ending. For example, according to statistics I found on the National Institute of Health's website, my home state of Michigan saw a nearly 20% increase in opioid-related overdose deaths from 2015 to 2016. Other states like Ohio and West Virginia have saw numbers even higher. Ohio saw a nearly 30% increase in opioid-related overdose deaths in the same time period. I want to look at a few factors that largely contribute to substance abuse not only here in the United States but worldwide, and these are things like poverty, unemployment, mental health, low educational status, criminal activity, and high-risk behaviors. The simple fact of the matter is that addiction tends to create circumstances in which poverty, crime, and homelessness can fester and grow. In cities that have the highest rates of overdose, we see crime rates and homelessness rates skyrocketing. Most of the studies done on this subject take all of these factors into consideration as well. But out of all of those factors, one that plays possibly the largest role is mental health, and how mental health issues are treated by communities. In rural areas, it can be difficult for those suffering from debilitating mental conditions to find and attain the proper medical care for not only addiction but mental health treatment as well. This is mainly an issue because in many rural areas there are simply not enough facilities or specialized personnel to deal with complex mental disorders. This can lead to lack of treatment, which can in turn cause more and more people to self-medicate through the use of illicit drugs or risky behavior. Substance abuse can be very difficult to combat in rural communities due to the lack of resources for preventing, treating, and recovering from addiction. And in larger cities, we see a lot of the very same problems, but often it's for somewhat different reasons. Cities have issues with prevention and treatment, but this is mostly due to the underfunding of rehabilitation clinics and treatment centers, combined with the stigma that surrounds addiction and drug use. Even today, many addicts in both rural and city areas are afraid to reach out for help for fear of punishment. In many rural areas that we look at, we see a steady increase in illicit drug use and alcohol use over the past 15 years. This is according to the 2015 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which was conducted by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We see nearly the same exact increase of drug and alcohol use in larger cities and metropolitan areas as well, although generally speaking, some substances seem to be a little more popular in rural areas. And this is at least in part because of easier access to illicit drugs in the cities versus the rural areas. And in many ways, this is a numbers game. Obviously, with larger populations, those of us who live in the cities will have more opportunities to purchase drugs, whereas in the rural areas, alcohol seems to be one of the fastest growing drugs of choice, simply because it's legal and readily available. When it comes to the impact on neighborhoods and communities, addiction has a ripple effect. Like throwing a stone into a pond or a lake, addiction ripples outward, affecting everyone and everything that it touches in some way or another. Let's first look at alcohol for an example of the devastating effects addiction can have on society as a whole. According to several studies, alcohol is truly the most dangerous and costly drug in existence at this time. A study conducted by Edmund J. Safra, professor of neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London, took many factors into consideration, like mortality likelihood, dependence, impairment of mental functioning, loss of tangible socioeconomic things, those are things like a house or a job, physical injury, and criminal activities. The economic cost to society was also considered in this study, and several similar studies showed that alcohol is one of the most costly substances on the planet, claiming one human life every 10 seconds. The World Health Organization estimates that around 3.3 million deaths every year are caused by alcohol abuse. That's 5.9% of all annual deaths worldwide. In these studies, cocaine and heroin came in second and third place for individual harm and economic cost to society. The economic cost of alcohol is simply jaw-dropping. According to the information I found at the Center for Disease Control's website, excessive alcohol abuse cost United States taxpayers around $249 billion in 2010. And yes, that's billion with a B. Out of all of the illicit substances out there, alcohol is by far the most expensive. If we broke that number down, it would be costing us around $807 for every citizen in the United States. If we really break down this cost even further, we can really see what aspects of alcohol cost the most. Of that $249 billion, it is estimated that about 70% of it is due to lost workplace productivity. Now, this is mainly because of job losses or missed time from work because of sickness from alcohol. Another 13% of that $249 billion pays for alcohol-related healthcare expenses, while another 10% is spent on criminal justice in response to alcohol-related crimes. And then we have the remaining 5%, which is paid towards motor vehicle crash costs related to alcohol. Taking a look at the numbers from heroin use, we see lower numbers, but some things to keep in mind are that heroin is simply not as easy to get as alcohol. You can't really walk into the supermarket and purchase a few grams of heroin the way that you can easily buy a bottle of booze. That being said, the economic impact of heroin has steadily been on the rise in the past 5 to 10 years and is currently estimated to be over $20 billion annually. Just like with alcohol, this cost includes things like lost workplace productivity, healthcare expenses, and criminal justice costs. Moving on to cocaine, we see another huge number. It is estimated that cocaine costs us roughly $193 billion a year on average. This high cost is due mostly to lost workplace productivity, healthcare costs, and criminal justice costs, all of which are related to cocaine abuse. Next on the list is methamphetamine. Crystal meth is basically neck and neck with heroin as far as the economic impact, right around $22 billion annually. And just like alcohol, cocaine, and heroin, these costs are related to crime, healthcare, and lost workplace productivity. All of these economic costs are mostly paid for by the taxpayers, so it's easy to see that we are literally hemorrhaging money when it comes to the economic impact of drugs and alcohol. However, there is another cost that is associated with all of these substances that is hard to put a dollar amount on, and that cost is human life. One of the first responses to addiction, not only in individuals but in communities and neighborhoods as well, is denial. Many people might just simply deny that their community or neighborhood may have a drug problem. Typically, this is because misunderstandings people have about chemical dependency and mental health, and we see this type of misinformation everywhere. From the big-time news media to small-town newspapers, the misinformation about addiction is one of the biggest barriers that communities have when going about addressing community-wide addiction problems. But the fact of the matter is this: addiction is often a mental health issue, usually connected to trauma or genetics, and by making addiction into a shameful issue, communities force it into the shadows where it can often snowball out of control. Many communities, both large and small, simply will not address the addiction problem until they are basically forced to. All of this denial only perpetuates the stigma that addiction is a choice and a moral failing, when in fact it is usually quite the opposite. There are communities that can play a much more positive role in all of this, but only if they are provided with the proper tools and knowledge. Studies show that people who receive early treatment for mental health issues are considerably less likely to turn to drugs and alcohol in an effort to find relief. Communities that get in on the ground floor and embrace mental health values will definitely be better equipped and ready when addiction rears its ugly head. Communities that are able to provide proper treatment for mental health issues tend to see lower crime rates, lower overdose rates, and even suicide rates steadily decline. Communities that are able to do this should be held up as a model for other communities to see, so that they may also make strides against the ever-deepening tide that is addiction. And I know this may sound like a bunch of just doom and gloom, but never forget that change starts at the local level. And an individual really can make a difference, especially when it comes to community-level issues like this. So I urge anyone in a community or neighborhood that is not doing that great of a job fighting addiction issues to get active and speak up. Go to your local community or township meetings and get involved. Speak up and stand up against the negative stigma surrounding addiction. If enough of us do this, we can really affect change for the better and truly give this story a happy ending. As always, I want to thank everyone for listening. If you really enjoy the show and want to help support what we do, visit patreon.com/addictions. That's patreon.com/addictions to learn how you can help support us. We have all sorts of extra goodies for those of you who choose to help out. And again, thanks for listening to Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm David Wagner, and remember, never quit quitting.
You smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long.